Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today, I'm joined by John Marvin from Texas State Optical, and we're going to be talking about the growth and success of their practice on the OI Show. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to be joined by you, John. Thank you for spending some time with me and hanging out on the OI Show. How are you today?
I'm happy to be here, Dr. Ketting. I'm doing well, doing great.
Yeah. John, give
Uh,
us a little bit of your background and then we'll start diving into TSO here in a minute. But just tell me a little bit about
okay.
you and your background.
Well, I started out of college pursuing advertising and marketing, and really more marketing focused than I was the advertising world. And but I spent a few years in an agency environment, ad agency, just fresh out of school. And then I ended up taking a marketing position with a major pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
My father is a family practitioner. He's passed away now, but he's a family practitioner for over 50 years in private practice, and a proverbial setup where my mother was his office manager.
Sure.
And so I grew up in that kind of private practice environment and understanding. And and so when I had an opportunity to go to the pharmaceutical industry, I felt like, wow, while I didn't decide to go to medical school, I thought, at least this is puts me in the family business in some way. And did fairly well in that, and enough that they offered me a promotion, and but it required moving to Chicago, Illinois. And I was born and raised in Western Kansas, and at that time was living in Wichita, and I just really didn't want to move to Chicago. So I, before I turned them down or before I made a decision, I started looking at other options, and I got into the eye care business at that point. I was hired by a large surgical practice in Wichita, Kansas. At that time was called the Eye Clinic of Wichita. One of the people that was involved, young guy in his mid 30s, was Bruce Green, who went on to create a practice called Green Vision. But he was a protege of John Hunkler's, who's an ophthalmologist out of Kansas City. And it really gave me a whole insight into the eye care business. And one of my primary jobs, roles in that position, was to build an optometric network for referral. And they had done quite a job of that. But I spent all my time working with optometry and building that relationship with them in the surgical practice, and then also was very involved in helping build a um, ambulatory surgical center, an ASC,
Mm,
there in
yeah.
Wichita. And during my time there, it was about 4 years doing that. I was introduced to an ophthalmologist in Houston, Texas, and ended up taking a position with Dr. Michael Mann of the Man at that time called the Mann Eye Clinic. I think he's
Right.
turned his clinic into an institute, whatever that means. But great guy, just really enjoy Dr. Mann. And again, was kind of brought to the marketplace in Houston to help strengthen a referral network. And when I don't know how familiar you are with optometry in Texas, but there is a whole different environment between ophthalmology and optometry in Texas versus what it had been in Kansas, where it was very compatible and very cooperative in nature. In Texas, very antagonistic. And so that was kind of a new environment for me. But one of the things I did was recommend, because again, surgical fees were being reduced. And so I suggested that we do a market research study, going back to my marketing background, and as a way of looking for referral channels. And through that study, discovered Texas State Optical, and was really fascinated to see the amount of share that that company had, that organization had, for primary eye care. Ended up going to them to try to work out a referral, and we didn't knew that, but they were fascinated by the research. And I left Man and began to do work directly for Texas State Optical. kind of in my own shop. That was the early 90s, and that led to being involved in the acquisition by the franchisees in the late 90s and early in 2000, and was offered the position to come on board in 2001 as the president.
Okay.
So the franchisees purchased the company from the franchisor in 2001. And since I had been so involved with them since 93, they said, would you be willing to come on full time as the new president?
Yeah.
And at that
Yeah.
time, I thought this is a great fixer upper because I had learned a lot about TSO in those short years. One of which was it has a phenomenal legacy behind it, having started and been founded in 1936, ironically, by four brothers from Chicago. So had I ended up going to Chicago in the earlier years, I might have uh, had a different opinion of Chicago. But
So,
anyway,
so John, give me
yeah,
a real brief background of what happened to TSO and how it grew to be so big before you got there.
okay,
And I know it's got a rich legacy from 1936 on, so
yeah,
try to keep that as brief as possible. But then,
sure.
like the franchisee franchise, like what are you talking about? Like that's just crazy. How big was it at the time? And then tell me through where we are today, what's happened in the last couple 20 years of you being there. Give me a brief overview of that.
Great question. Founded in 1936 by four brothers, two of whom were optometrists. And they grew the organization to over 300 locations by the early 60s,
Wow.
and were, by all accounts, probably the first, if not only at the time, chain of that size of eye care. And it was wholly owned by these four brothers. So
Uh-huh.
they owned all of the locations. They built a massive optical lab to service it. And this did not win them any friends in Texas optometry, which the Optometry Act was modified then to limit the number of locations any one optometrist could own to no more than three. And these guys had 300. So obviously, a lot at risk. They filed a suit to stop it, fought it, litigated it all the way through the United States Supreme Court that ruled against them ultimately, ruling that states had the right to establish their own optometry laws. And so they were left to sell off these locations to the doctors who had been employed to operate them.
Okay.
And that took the better part of the 60s to get all of that done. And then in the early 70s, the brothers sold it to GD Searle, the pharmaceutical company out of Chicago, Illinois, out of Chicago.
Huh.
And they also owned a what they called Searle Vision, and which ultimately got sold to Pearl Vision, along
Sorry.
with that's all right, along with Texas State Optical. So in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, Texas State Optical was owned by Pearl Vision,
Oh,
based in Dallas, Texas.
okay.
And at that time, Pearl Vision converted the model to a traditional franchise model
Okay.
and began franchising TSO locations.
Got it. Got it.
And then, because it was really not the culture of TSO was not a traditional franchise culture. And they had Pearl sold it to a group of investors in the late 80s that that came out of Sterling Optical. And the president at that time of Sterling Optical, who put together the financing to buy it, just abused the heck out of the organization. And between 1988 and 1993, when I first got involved, there was a tremendous amount of antagonism between the owners of the locations and the new franchisor.
Right.
And ultimately, that blew up. And without getting into a whole lot of detail, that blew up and was in the hands of a creditor management company And it was out of that group that the franchisees decided to purchase the company from the franchisor. Actually, really, what they were buying was the brand, the Texas State Optical brand, because the new organization that I was involved in helping create became a member owned cooperative model and a straight brand license model. So we are not a franchise in the traditional sense, which the difference being franchises are very involved in the operations of the business. And actually, that's why you buy a franchise is for the operational system. These offices already had their own systems, but they wanted the brand. So we set it up as a licensing company that people pay a percentage of their revenues to use the Texas State Optical retail brand.
I see. Okay.
And at that time, our we had about 100 locations, and we're doing on an average of about $580,000 a location.
Okay.
The average age was in the high 50s, old organization. And that's why I said it was a great fixer-upper because it
Hmm.
had a big legacy, but to give it any kind of future, it needed to be remade. So
What
we
have you
started,
what did you see as the opportunity when you said fixer? What did you see as the potential?
well, at that time, the brand itself was on its way to irrelevancy. It had lost a lot of its consumer value.
Hmm.
And I used to make the analogy, it's much like Montgomery Ward's, where everyone remembers it fondly, but it's
Yeah,
really no longer relevant.
right.
And that's kind of the way it was. But with such a rich heritage behind that brand, I thought this was the marketing guy in me said, this is a great opportunity to kind of rebrand this organization in a
Yeah,
new way that appeals to young optometry.
yeah, yeah.
And whereas at the time, if you'll remember the early 90s, there was another little organization out of Texas, Houston area called Vision Source with
Hmm.
Glenn Ellisor and John McCall and Kevin
Yep.
McDade, and they were building a large, really doctor alliance for cost of goods reductions, and so TSO on the other hand, and they were appealing to people, big practice, want to join us. You don't have to change your name. I, on the other hand, had an organization that said if you want to join us, you got to change your name. Otherwise,
Right.
why would you join us if you didn't want to license the
Yeah.
brand? So what we found was a community of young optometrists, many of them lease space doctors in Texas, that wanted to own their own practice, but they
Yeah.
didn't know what to do, didn't know how to do it, and they saw the brand as an opportunity to give them instant credibility. And so we began to focus on helping young ODs build their own private practice and license the brand from us and grow. And we opened 84 new locations doing that from scratch. Those are all started from total scratch, building those
So
practices.
today, how many practices are there?
Today we have 90.
Uh-huh.
We reached a high of about 134 in the 2018, 2019. But the difference between then and now is private equity consolidation.
Got it. Okay. So the practitioners who are currently with you, they own their own practice and they're
Yes,
licensing from you.
that's
So
correct.
what are the things that they are getting in addition to the name? Like what does Texas State Optical do in my practice if I am licensing from you?
Well, what we do because of the nature of the contract we have with our members, that's what we call them. We don't have any authority over their operations.
Yeah.
But what we do, like we did with the young ODs, we set up a system. And if you want
Uh-huh.
to take advantage of it, you can. But we really offer this buffet of support services, everything from staff training, recruitment training,
Mm,
to collective purchasing. We
yeah.
serve as a doctor alliance for purchasing, but we also um, have internet. We have a strong internet website support system to help
Sure.
digital advertising, but it's really very much a la carte, somewhat like iDoc has become, in the fact that you're a member, but and they've got a menu of services that you can access, but no one's obligated to use any of them.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
so
So
we,
without, I mean, you don't have to tell me the name of them,
oh,
but a couple of the practices that are just crushing it, and you're like, hey,
mhm.
we've obviously it's the practitioner as well who's adopting them, but what are some examples of some practices that you can think of like, wow, like they took this and they ran with it and they're crushing. What did they do that really helped them become what they are?
That's a great question. And I would say probably the best example of that is a practice in Mansfield, Texas, that's owned by Dr. Cameron Smith. And Dr. Smith, I worked with for over 3 years, helping him find a location.
Hmm.
We have a real estate firm that we work with, and so we were looking at various locations for him. And this was in 2007, and he decided on Mansfield, and basically was a sponge. And he sat and tried to take advantage of everything that we were providing, recruiting, training, best practices that we had put together,
Mm-hmm.
and wasn't afraid to try something and and um, and put it in practice. And we worked with him to reach out into his community, grow it from a marketing standpoint. But I'll tell you, the in a private practice setting, it all centers around the doctor, the owner, in our organization, because we aren't involved operationally. If we came in and had a standard operating procedure manual that says every exam is going to look like this, every
Yeah,
office is going to look like this, it'd be different. But we don't
sure.
have that. Intentionally we don't have it. So a lot of it is totally up to the individual, the doctor. And what our doctors that are successful do is they're willing to listen, and they're open to suggestions, and they're willing to try some things, acknowledging that they really don't have any confidence in their own abilities at that point to understand how to go about doing this. Because most of them, if not all of them, have never done it before. And I've opened, or not I, our group, our team has opened 84 locations
Yeah,
and brought them all to a very predictable sales number over 5 years.
yeah,
And so we kind of know what it takes to open a practice from scratch and get it up and running. And for those doctors who say, that's why I'm joining, I need the benefit of this experience, and they listen, it works. Dr. Smith now has he'll do this year, probably closing in on um, strong seven-figure practice. I mean, it's far multiple. I'll put it this way: I won't disclose because it's his business, but it's far above $2 million. I'll put it that way.
wow, that's
And
awesome.
so he's built a bait. He's opened another location and taken on a partner, and they'll go ahead and take on a third partner. And he's done just a tremendous job in this community that really is a suburb of Arlington in the and Fort Worth area. Another practice that had already established itself in Beaumont is a practice that we call Dallin Road, that was owned by um, Dr. Brian Blunt until he just recently sold it to a group of his partners, sold out his portion of it. But it
Uh-huh.
also is a massive size practice. And again, Dr. Blunt and his partners, they just sat down and said, help us, give us some ideas. And so we went in and put together kind of a recommended plan back in the early 90s. And that thing has grown to a monster size over
Wow.
the years. And then there's a dozen more that I could point to that are
Yeah,
just, but the common theme is being willing, being coachable, being teachable, and
yeah,
being willing to open and consider, and not feel insecure that, well, if I act like I don't know what I'm doing, then you will think less of me.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's like,
People.
don't ask me to do your eye exam. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I can help build a business,
Yeah.
so.
John, you've seen this industry from the bottom to the top, and you see trends and things changing all the time.
Mhm.
So a lot of our listeners are in private practice, many of them are. What do you see as some of the greatest challenges and threats to private practice, and how are you preparing Texas State Optical doctors to encounter those? What are some things that you're worried about for the future?
Um, well, I'll be real candid. Probably is not going
Please.
to win me a whole lot of popularity here right now, but I think the biggest threat to private practice optometry is academic optometry and organized optometry, the
Okay.
AOA and the 24 colleges of optometry.
Yeah, that's probably not a popular answer.
No, it's not, but
What do you mean by
I'm at this
that?
point, I don't care. Um, well, and I have great friends that are deans of these schools,
Sure.
and it's born out of, I mean, and frankly, um, I think to some degree they would agree with me. And that is, I'm sitting and talking to one to recount an experience, and I said, what is it that we could do to help you better prepare your graduates for private practice? I avoided the classic, why don't you teach practice management? But I said, what could we do to better prepare? And he said, John, there's nothing, because until they put questions on the national boards about private practice and practice management,
Yeah,
there's nothing we're going to do, because our entire job is to prepare the graduates to be able to pass the boards.
that's right.
And that's it.
Yeah,
And so that has, I mean, that has no, it's completely agnostic when it comes to the mode of practice.
yeah.
That job is the same whether it's someone who all they want is a part-time job in optometry as an
Mm-hmm.
optometrist, or someone who wants to own their own practice.
Yeah.
But what's happened with such, and then the other factor in this is, unfortunately, to me, in my opinion, unfortunately, optometry has taken this binary choice. You either are going to pursue medical optometry, or you're going to be a nasty refractive retailer.
Uh-huh.
And I think that position, and of course the academics and the profession itself, are all gearing towards medical optometry. I mean, that's the whole focus. Um, if there's, you go to expos or any type of continuing education forum, the only people talking about the retail piece of this are the para optometric people, the office management education, the ABO, the opticians. You
Yeah.
don't see a big schedule of retail, optical, dispensary education, lens education for the doctors. Those are all into retina and glaucoma and
Yeah.
myopia management and those types of things. So this profession has set itself up to saying you're either in the medical optometry camp, or you're one of those nasty retail refractive people.
Short
And
of getting the schools to change how they are teaching because they are needing to get people passed through boards, and you're
Mhm.
right. The business side of things is a really. How do you think somebody can become successful other than joining Texas State Optical? Maybe they live in Connecticut or Washington. What are some things that you think that a practitioner could do to prepare themselves to be successful in private practice?
Well, I'll give a plug. I write a column for InVision magazine, and I
Uh-huh.
have for over 10 years, since 2014. And I address that every month in my column in that. And probably to summarize it all, it would be, listen to your customers. Now, when
Mm-hmm.
I use the word customer, it upsets a lot of optometrists who will tell me, John, we don't have customers, we have patients. And I said, well, you can call them whatever you want to, but the people that you're calling patients consider themselves customers. And you need to listen to them because this profession created Warby Parker.
Yeah.
And they created Warby Parker because they quit listening to customers. And they
Yeah.
created Zenny Optical.
Yeah.
All the things that the profession points to with disdain and disgust, they themselves created because they didn't listen to the customer and what the
Sure.
customer preferences were.
For sure.
And so that part and parcel for the guy or gal in Connecticut that wants to own their own practice, I would say listen and understand your customer.
Yeah.
And
That's
and the reason I use the difference between customer and patients is because patients, we think of patients in a healthcare environment as people who are do what they're told to do.
hmm
Customers dictate the terms of the relationship with
Yeah.
their providers. Patients don't.
That's
The
so true.
the healthcare provider dictates the terms. And
Yeah.
in our business, where six, if not seven out of every $10 comes from the optical dispensary, our business is a very much retail business.
hmm
And if you try to live off of the money you'll make in a purely medical and optometry environment, you won't make a whole lot of money.
Right. No,
But
that's
if
so
you put
true.
them together, if you quit this binary choice and embrace who we are and just say, we're going to provide eye care. And if it's medical in nature, we can do that. But we also are committed to a robust retail experience, great products, great eyewear, and customer service that is focused on creating loyalty among our customers for
hmm
referrals. So those are the things you got to really concentrate. Those are big picture things. And of course, there are tactical steps in all of that.
Yeah, building that patient loyalty, I couldn't agree with you more, is a real challenge. It seems to be something that my generation is not as good at as your generation, and making sure that patients know that we want them back and that we treat them in such a
Hmm.
way with that they will come back. This has been really insightful. I think I have a little bit better understanding of Texas State Optical. I've heard of you guys for a really long time. I know that you're a behemoth and you shift and move the industry in incredible ways. I can see why in talking to you with your leadership and so forth. And any closing thoughts of things that you want our industry and our practitioners to know more of, and how to make their practices successful as time goes on? What would be your last thoughts?
But I think that I, I I love the idea of private practice. I love the nature of it. Like I said earlier, I grew up in it,
Yeah.
and it saddens me to believe that the profession itself is not fighting harder to preserve it.
hmm
And um, in some ways, though, I don't want to put all of it on them. It's going on in healthcare in general. I mean, it used to be like my dad, family physician, would own their own practice. Today, it's hard to
Right.
find a family physician that's not employed by some large medical clinic or medical system. So it's happening in healthcare itself. But a lot of it is centered around this notion in optometry that we have to live with this third party payer system. I
Right.
mean, and it's ridiculous. I think it's just ludicrous for people to think they have to insure themselves from a $500 or $600 expenditure when they'll go across the street to Walmart, use a MasterCard, and buy an $800 flat screen television.
Right. That's so
I mean,
true.
why is it that we deal in this world that says no, $150 is all you're allowed for that frame, and then we're going to be real picky about the lit. I mean, and optometry has allowed that to consume private practice. So now you have a practitioner and say, why don't you quit taking these things? Oh, I can't do that. I can't do
Mm,
that. I'll lose my business.
yeah.
And I just don't believe that's true. So
Yeah.
really evaluate that. My
Yeah.
advice is evaluate that and decide, why is it that one offers a exam for $99, but another one says I got to have $165 for it. And if you're an engineer at Exxon Mobil in Houston and you call an office and say, how much do you charge for your eye exam? And that one says 99 and the other one says 165, what are you to think? I mean, you're going, well, wait a minute. Are those the same thing? But the 165 is being done because I have to, John, because Medicare and CMS. And I said, well, how much of your business is Medicare? About 10%. So you're pricing your entire program around a third party payer that really represents a very small portion of your business. But then it gets translated into United Healthcare, Humana, Aetna, et cetera. And then you've got these vision plans, these benefit plans that are charging $25 a month in a premium and giving people $150, $160 allowance for a frame. And then having a formula for lenses that no consumer understands. Did you realize that only about 25 to 26% of everyone who has a VSP plan uses it? Only
Oh, I didn't know that.
25%. Yeah. Only 25% of those covered under VSP use it. And the reason is no one understands it. You walk into an office and you don't have any idea how this pays for anything.
Uh-huh.
So we've kind of allowed all of this stuff to complicate and get in between the doctor and the patient
Yeah.
and that relationship
Yeah.
when it
And
could
that
be a
is
lot simpler.
that's true.
Anyway, that's a long-winded
Yeah.
answer to my closing statement. So,
Well, obviously that's incredible. The wealth of knowledge that you have. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I think we might need to do it again sometime because I think we could dig into some leadership thing. We could dig into management of people and so many things with all the stuff that you have. So I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us and letting us know a little bit of the history and your background and how you guys have become so successful. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
well, I really appreciate the invitation, and I'd love to come back anytime you've got time for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for joining us for this episode. Make sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned next time for more great content from the Optometric Insights Show.